iGlobenews brings global views.
Welcome to a new episode of iGlobeViews, our weekly podcast where we discuss world politics and current events. My name is Diana Mountain-Markoff. I'm editor-in-chief of iGlobenews.org, and here today to discuss our topic is the world-renowned China expert, Professor Susanne Weigelin-Schwierzig. Our topic today, Kowtowing or cooperation, which is China's vision for a new world order. And for the record, today is April 9th, 2026. In an interview with Tucker Carlson in October 2024, Donald Trump said, and I quote, "The one thing you never want to happen is you never want Russia and China uniting. I'm going to have to ununite them, and I think I can do that." End of quote. His actions in Iran and Venezuela are having the opposite effect. They are pushing China and Russia closer together. Before the U.S. took out Maduro, China imported 4% of its oil from Venezuela. Before the war in Iran, China imported 13% of its oil from Iran and an additional 42% from the Gulf countries. All this oil passed through the Strait of Hormuz, which was open before the U.S. and Israel attacked Iran on the 28th of February. A new 5-year economic plan adopted in Beijing this week includes a new gas pipeline from Russia. The Power of Siberia 2 gas pipeline is a 2,600-kilometer project connecting Russian Arctic gas to China through Mongolia. China and Russia are diverting the gas that used to flow to Europe from Russia to China. So my question to you is, will Russia be able to fill this energy gap? How do you see the relationship between Russia and China evolving? And how will this affect the balance of power with the West and the U.S.?
Thank you for this interesting question, and hello to everybody. First of all, I think the Power Siberia 2 issue is a really interesting one, especially if you compare it to the Power of Siberia 1, which is a pipeline that was built between Russia and China after 2014. And it's very interesting to see that China had bargained with Russia for a very, very long time for Power of Siberia 1, and the Chinese never signed the contract until Russia was in a very delicate situation after the Maidan incidents in 2014 and after Russia had annexed Crimea. So it was sanctioned from all over the place. It was in a very, very difficult situation. And it was exactly in this situation that China signed the contract and actually finally reached the aim of lowering the prices, which it had pursued for many, many years of bargaining with Russia. So now the situation is so interesting because they now write into their 5-year plan that they want to have the Power of Siberia 2. But last year in September, when Russia actually wanted to sign the contract, China did not sign it. So maybe some people remember that in September, Vladimir Putin was in Beijing during the military parades on the occasion of the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II. And before that, we had a SCO meeting in Tianjin. And as a matter of fact, China wanted to have a new development bank initiated by SCO, and Russia wanted to have the contract for the Power of Siberia number 2 signed on the same occasion. And Russia blocked the founding of the development bank, and China did not sign the Power of Siberia number 2 contract. So this shows that, these two countries seem to be very close, and because of strategic reasons, they need to, what they call, coordinate their actions very closely. But there is also fierce competition and distrust between the two. And to sort of assess in which situation the need for cooperation is bigger than the need to actually push your competitor out of the game, is very, very difficult. And they call this kind of foreign policy or relationship between the two countries pragmatic. And pragmatic means that they actually go back and forth according to the situation. And now China, by not signing the contract back in September of last year, now will be forced to sign the contract in a situation where actually China is weaker than Russia. So they made a tactical mistake. Because now Russia is not so much affected, of course, by the crisis in the Strait of Hormuz, because they don't need this kind of thing. But China is obviously, as you just said, very strongly affected. For that reason, China has to build up more and more capacity to buy more gas and oil from Russia. And for that reason, it needs the power of Siberia too. And for that reason, it now has to finalize the contract. And this shows, that sometimes things are going up and sometimes things are going down. So for us to understand this relationship with China sitting in the driver's seat and Russia having to listen to whatever China wants is a totally wrong perception. They are two friends and competitors at the same time. And in every constellation, you look at BRICS decisions, you look at SCO decisions, you look at what they do in Iran or don't do in Iran, you will see that they have a different approach to things. And that despite the fact that the US are structurally pushing them closer and closer together, they still keep a certain distance. And the reason for this is, of course, not only because objectively they're competing in certain fields, but also because for China, the Sino-US relationship is much more important than the Sino-Russian relationship.
So do you think that these developments, first in Venezuela, then Iran, we don't know exactly how that's going to play out, has that brought Russia and China? Would you say you mentioned they're competitors, but they're friends, but they're always looking for their best advantage. But at the end of the day, do you think it will have brought them closer together?
Yes, as I just said, I think objectively speaking, so when you look at things from a structural point of view, there is no other option than for China and Russia getting closer together. This is very, very true. But things are more complicated than their structures, right? And there are also different layers of structures you have to look at. You have to look at the military situation, the diplomatic situation, but also the economic situation. And of course, for China, it is enormously important that they diminish their reliance on oil and gas from the Near East. In the past, China had better prices when buying their oil and gas from the Near East. And especially Iran and Venezuela were very important. Why? Because these are two sanctioned countries. And China was powerful enough not to take these sanctions into consideration, but to continue buying oil from these two countries. But of course, if they buy oil and gas from these two sanctioned countries, the price will be really, really low, right? And so China sort of knew that this was a very risky business, at least with regard to Iran. I'm not so sure whether they actually anticipated what finally happened in Venezuela, but they actually anticipated the war in Iran. And they had made preparations for a long, long time. And their relationship with Iran is such that they knew about the kind of preparations that Iran made in anticipating the outbreak of this war. So from this point of view, I think, China must be very nervous, not only because they now see that they are still over-reliant on oil and gas imports from the Near East. And at the same time, they also see that this advantages situations that they could buy oil and gas from sanctioned countries is also sort of no longer existent. So one of the reasons actually why China was pushing renewable energies so much during the last years is because they calculated that they can reduce their reliance on imports from the Near East by augmenting their reliance on renewable energy. But now they see that even though they invested so heavily in building up their capacity in terms of renewable energy, it still is not enough to actually reduce their reliance on fossil energies, to a point where it's not so important for them anymore. Basically, what we are seeing at this moment is that the kind of energy individuals, households need is actually supplied for by renewable energies in China, but the industry is still heavily reliant on imports from the Near East. And if they now sort of build the power of Siberia too, of course, this will reduce their reliance on the Near East. But I think China is known for being good in learning from experiences. And one thing they might have learned from this experience is that you should never rely on one supplier or one supply region. So from this point of view, I think they will still look for many other countries that do have oil and gas to act as their suppliers, even if they have to pay a little bit more, because they don't want to be sort of solely reliant on Russia, which is also true because of the fact that they know that they are not only friends, but also competitors.
So here too, China, very interestingly, as you discuss, has a very pragmatic approach also to green energy, which is very interesting. A different approach than the West has, where green energy is sold as like saving the planet. But for the Chinese, it's a very pragmatic approach. And at the end of the day, it's paying off for China as well. Now, let me move from the oil markets to the financial markets. The war in Iran has triggered a steep change in the rate that China is selling off U.S. Treasury bill holdings. T-bill holdings are a good barometer for geopolitical tensions, and the rate that China and BRICS countries have accelerated their sale of T-bills even before the Iran war is just increasing. Today, Chinese holdings have fallen to the lowest level since September 2008. Data from the U.S. Department of Treasury shows that China's holdings declined to $633.4 billion from $682.6 billion in November 2025. So that's a fall of $50 billion in 4 months. So that's quite a steep decline. Beijing has also ordered that all its commercial banks sell their T-bill holdings as the Chinese withdrawal from US dollar denominated assets accelerates. And this sell-off actually already began when Trump disclosed his Liberation Day sanctions on China. So this is not a new development, but it has been accelerated now with the war in Iran. And among the key effects of this sell-off is that U.S. Treasury impacts, of course, impact the rate at which the U.S. Treasury can borrow money. So money is becoming more expensive for the United States as the price of these treasuries go up. Is it true that China is really selling these U.S. Treasury bonds? And what are the key impacts of this? And could this be a prelude to an attack on Taiwan? Because let us not forget, Russia did also reduce its T-bill holdings before invading Ukraine.
Well, as a matter of fact, as you just pointed out, China has been selling its T-bills for quite some time. It's not only November last year, they actually are slowly but steadily reducing. And this is a major problem for the US. And maybe some of us remember that during the Biden administration tenure, the then finance minister of the US, Ms. Yellen, used to suddenly travel to China and talk to them. And people were wondering, why would she suddenly travel to China and talk to China? And very often this was connected to the question of the T-bills, because the T-bills not only make money for the US government more expensive to borrow, they're also part and parcel of the balance sheet of many different US banks. And we might remember that there were some banks in quite some trouble during the Biden administration time. And one of the reasons why they were in such trouble was because of the value of the T-bills that they had that they're carried in their balance sheet. So there's the question whether or not China is actually buying or not buying, selling or not selling, is a big question. And I think since the Biden administration, we see two things happening. On the one hand side, China is slowly but steadily reducing. They don't go very fast because then they lose a lot of money, because obviously if there is a very, very high supply of T-bills on the market, then the prices obviously low. So they don't want to lose too much money. That's the reason why they go down slowly but steadily. But this tendency has been going on for much longer than our current crisis situation, which is why I don't see this as an indication that we are going to have a major military crisis over Taiwan within the next days to come. On the other hand, Japan is now buying and buying and buying. So the US has actually realized that they don't have the leverage to tell the Chinese government whether or not they should buy or sell T-bills, but they still have the leverage to tell the Japanese that they have to buy. And so now I think Japan has now turned into the biggest lender of the US. Germany is also following very closely behind Japan, as far as I'm informed. So they're now sort of trying to sort of convince their close allies to sort of replace that, as the Chinese are selling their US Treasury bonds. So from my point of view, the Chinese are actually selling US Treasury bonds because they anticipate that the US sooner or later will seize an opportunity to start sanctioning China. And as they view that the US is actually itself in major financial problems, they are very worried about whether or not the US might see some kind of opportunity in order to freeze Chinese assets outside and to sanction China. And because of this, they are actually taking these measures. And of course, in a situation where they see that the US is spending lots and lots of money on a war, it is a good situation also to signal to the US that China still has quite some leverage over the US because of the amount of T-bills it's still holding.
Yes, I mean, the US is in some definite economic dire straits at the moment, and I think I mean the numbers we are getting are not confirmed, but anywhere between $1 to $2 billion a day this war in Iran is costing them. So wherever you place it, it's a lot of money. So they need a lot of financing, and it would be a disaster if China would just dump all their T-bills onto the market. So I think, as usual, they're being very prudent about this and looking to maximize their own interests without crashing the world market. Another issue, which of course, which we have discussed in the past, but which belongs into this discussion as well, is the yuan. So in February 2025, Chinese President Xi called for the yuan to become a global reserve currency. And the Chinese yuan has quadrupled its share as the currency of choice to settle global trade deals, increasing its share from just under 2% in 2020 to over 8% by early 2025, according to data from SWIFT. Likewise, Russia now settles almost all of its mutual trade deals in national currencies. Iran has now offered tanker passage in exchange for Chinese yuan settlement. Economists have pointed out that if the dollar loses its reserve currency status, this will create enormous headaches for the US government, as the borrowing costs to refinance the gigantic $37 trillion debt will become even more expensive. Will the petrodollar collapse after the Iran war? Energy trade in renminbi, together with Western sanctions, and China's industrial might will bind Moscow even closer to China, which we already discussed. What does this mean for the rest of the world? And if US dollar hegemony collapses, how will this affect the US and China's world position economically and politically, and US-China relations?
Well, very interestingly, here again, China is out for an incremental option, whereas Russia seems to be very eager to change the petrodollar and the dollar regime in the world as soon as possible. Of course, Russia has much more grudge against the US than China currently has, and it's understandable. And they also have sort of a plan and an idea how to replace the dollar by some other kind of currency regime. But the Chinese actually are always on the cautious side. They don't want to go too fast. I think we already discussed this in one of our other conversations. They want to make sure that they can actually handle the situation, because if you are the major currency of the world, then, oh, be careful. I mean, you really are responsible for quite something. And if you don't know how to handle the situation, you might lose this opportunity to your own detriment and also to the detriment of the rest of the world. So you have to make sure that you know what you're doing. So what they are doing is actually very much repeating something that they have a historical experience about. This is really, really interesting, and most people don't know about this. And I must say that I only learned about this issue like 10 years ago. It took me very long until I finally understood this. So when the Kuomintang, the national party in China, was in a civil war with the Communist Party of China, one way for the Communist Party to win this war was actually by occupying more and more territory of the Chinese state and bringing this territory under the leadership of the Communist Party of China. So you can virtually see how sort of the Communist Party of China was moving from the northeast to the southwest, eating one piece of Chinese territory after the other, while the national government was actually retreating. And the kind of territory it occupied ended up being Taiwan, actually. In comparison to mainland China, this is a very, very small piece. So at the same time this happened, the Communist Party of China, in all those territories that it could occupy, introduced a new currency. So this implies that the national currency for China, and sometimes you can think of China as a world as such, right? So the world called China was actually ruled by two different parties, and this one party was advancing, and while it was advancing, it was introducing its own currency as the main currency or the only currency that you could use in those territories that were under Communist Party jurisdiction. So this implies that this enormous amount of a currency that was a national currency before the Chinese communists actually took over more and more territory, this enormous amount of currency suddenly was the currency for a shrinking amount of territory. And the shrinking amount of territory was also a shrinking amount of population. And so what happened? So finally, the renminbi, which was actually the currency that was introduced to Chinese Communist Party occupied areas before 1949 already. So the renminbi started becoming the national currency because it occupied more and more territory, while the Fabi, the national currency of China, actually got stuck in a very, very small piece of territory. And this actually brought about hyperinflation. And hyperinflation in the Chinese cities under national government rule was the second main reason why the Communist Party of China finally won the civil war. So this is their historical experience. So you can introduce, local currencies in all kinds of situations, and you slowly but steadily grow from 2% to 4% to 6% to 8% to 10%, and so on and so forth. And at the same time, you reduce the amount of trade that is being traded by US dollar. So this does not only, I'm not an economist, but I'm a historian. So if I take this historical example I just told you as my advisor to assessing the current situation and the strategies that the Chinese government has, then I understand the following. By introducing more and more local currencies, they actually reduce the sectors of trade that are being traded by US dollar. And if you reduce the sectors of trade in which the US dollar is used, it is like cutting down on the territory where this currency is actually in action. So this will imply that sooner or later, we'll have a lot of dollars for a diminishing number of sectors of trade, international trade, that are being undertaken but with the help of US dollars. So this implies that sooner or later we'll have too many dollars around for the kind of trade we are actually pursuing by US dollars. And this will bring about inflation. And I sometimes, talk to specialists in this field, and they kind of look at me and say, oh, because interestingly, this is not, as far as I understand, they don't discuss this issue openly. But I think this is a hidden issue. And even if it's not a hidden issue, I think as Chinese politicians very often only stick to a certain policy if they have an adequate historical example by which they can understand what might happen if you actually take this decision at this moment. You never know the consequences, but from past experience, you can learn what the consequences were in the past. That's why learning from history is so important in the context of Chinese politics. And I think that they will stick to this experience and say, I think that this is, we don't want to be nervous. We don't want to be too fast, but we will eventually be successful if we sort of take over more and more sectors, more and more countries, more and more goods to be traded without the US dollar. And it doesn't need to be the renminbi. Why does it not need to be the renminbi? Because at this point, China thinks that it is well protected with the renminbi not being an international currency, even though they might have this idea for the future. But at this point, the renminbi is non-convertible, and this means that China learned from the experience of the Asian crisis back in the 1990s, that it was well protected from overall crisis, economic crisis in the world, by having a currency that is non-convertible. And they will not give up this asset before they have a better grasp of what the new system will be like.
Well, this is a really interesting analysis of this topic, which I haven't heard anywhere else. And thank you, Suzanne, for sharing that with us. But it proves again that China has this long-term approach. And as you say, looking at history and learning from its own history. And this long-term approach is something that really works to the benefit of probably any country. But China, being a one-party country, so to speak, can use this long-term approach as opposed to other countries which constantly have maybe changing political interests. Another area where China has taken this long-term approach is, of course, its cornering of rare earths on the world market. Which it has done consistently over the past years. And to counter U.S. tariffs and sanctions, Beijing increased its stranglehold on rare earths. China now dominates the global rare earth industry, controlling approximately 60 to 70% of mining and over 90% of processing and magnet manufacturing. This monopoly allows Beijing to exert strategic geopolitical leverage using export restrictions on these critical elements, essential for tech and defense, as a tool to protect national interests. The U.S. is attempting to control China's access to advanced semiconductor chips that fuel today's cutting-edge technologies and, of course, artificial intelligence, while China is leveraging its control over the supply and refinements of the 17 chemical elements known as rare earths. So my question to you is, now that the U.S. is tied down in the Middle East, will China use the rare earth card to entice President Trump to opt for peace in exchange for rare earths? And who holds more cards here?
Well, China is in a very, very good position regarding rare earths because, as you just mentioned, they not only have rare earths and have been mining rare earths for a long time, but they're very good in processing, and they hold all the patents and everything that is somewhat related to the processing of rare earths. So they hold very, very good cards here. And I think that to some degree one could say that Donald Trump thought that by having this war in Iran and sort of creating this crisis um, around the Hormuz Straits, he can actually sort of use yet another tool in his bargaining about China's rare earth leverage. And he knows that this is very, very important for the US, and he pretends that he is solving the problem. But despite the fact that he is signing one contract after the other all over the world regarding the unearthing of raw earths, he still hasn't solved the problem of processing raw earths. And I think I mentioned before in one of our conversations that, China has been working on this issue since 1954. So they have an enormous amount of experience, of technologies, of trained people working in this field. So it's really, really difficult to change this constellation within a short period of time. This is very, very clear. And I think that the US knows very well that China has this enormously strong card. And for that reason, they always have to take a Chinese reaction to any geopolitical action into consideration, because as you correctly mentioned, I mean, if the US does something that is very much against the interest of China, then China will immediately use its card of raw earths, and it will not sit idle and try to bargain something without showing the US, you know what? I have this raw earth card here, and if you don't do something that is to my benefit, then I will simply give you a push by not exporting certain raw earths or exporting at a very, very slow speed, or creating all kinds of difficulties surrounding these raw earths. And at this moment, we know that this is a very delicate situation because the US is running out of stocks, and this implies that they cannot replace those F-15s that are being shot down in Iran and things like that. So the situation is very delicate. So what are the Chinese going to do? So you always have to have in mind that Chinese foreign policy is very much interest focused. And interest focused means that China always tries to take measures that are good for their own interests. And then, of course, if it is also good for the rest of the world, or at least many countries in this world, then China can also sort of create for itself an image that it not only works for its own interests, but also for the interest of, let's put it that way, humanity, right? So in this situation with the raw earth, China is using this raw earth leverage, especially in order to be able to solve the Taiwan issue according to the plans and aims that Beijing has defined. Right. So we have to have this in mind. So China will never use this leverage too much in a situation that is not related to somewhat solving or making yet another step towards solving the Taiwan issue. So this is the core question. And everybody has to understand this, that this Taiwan issue for China is the core question, because it's a question that relates to its geopolitical posture, to its geopolitical capacities, and also to its domestic legitimacy. So it is such an enormously important issue that China has to calculate every step in geopolitics in relation to what kind of impact it would have on the Taiwan question. And for that reason, we can expect China to sort of use its leverage in terms of raw earth time and again, But whenever China uses this leverage, we have to understand that it is somehow related to the Taiwan issue, even if we do not see that it is openly related or that they articulate this kind of relationship. They usually do not articulate this. We have to understand this by other means and assess whether or not this is related. And whenever they use their leverage, we know that something is happening with regard to the Taiwan question.
So if we want to stay now on the Taiwan question before moving on to other issues, of course, this week there was this historic visit of Taiwan's opposition leader, Cheng Li-won. That was really quite something. She, of course, is the chairman of the Kuomintang, the largest opposition party in Taiwan, and she visited Beijing at a time of increased Chinese military pressure on Taiwan, which Beijing, of course, views as its own territory. And as the opposition-dominated parliament stalls a government plan for $40 billion in extra defense spending, this was, of course, a very interesting time to choose her historic visit. And she said during a visit to she said her party's founder was Sun Yat-sen, and she said she seeks reconciliation with China, offering praise at his tomb for the country's so for China's achievement following the Communist Party revolution. So she was praising the developments after they, of course, lost the war and retreated to Taiwan. So what significance does this visit have? Could the KMT, that is her party, actually win an election? And of course, the question on everyone's mind, which you also mentioned before when we were discussing, is attacking Taiwan something President Xi is in any time in the future, do you think, considering?
Well, from my point of view, the military takeover of Taiwan is not the best solution, according to Xi Jinping's mind, but only the second best solution, right? So they actually think that if they use something like pressure, coercion, but at the same time also provide opportunities, provide benefits, this sort of ambivalent a policy towards Taiwan will sooner or later generate a split of the Taiwanese elite with regard to the question how they should relate to mainland China. So by the China using this tool of blockades of the island time and again, they show the elites that they can actually have an enormous impact on the economic well-being of the island by repeating these blockades at an ever higher speed. So this, usually during the last years, since Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan and they started doing this blockade for the first time, they usually do it like twice a year. But they can easily sort of speed up, do it like every month. And in this situation, this would mean that every month the Taiwan economy would be isolated from the world for a certain period of time. And this will, of course, have an enormous impact on the internal production of things, of course, also the export, the import, supply chains, everything will be sort of interrupted and the situation will be extremely uncertain because you never know when your next blockade will happen, right? And they calculate that in this situation, the elites will split. Some of them will say, we'll die economically if we do not find a new solution in our relationship to mainland China. And others will say, now that mainland is putting so much pressure on us that it is time for us to resist. And resisting means that we have to go through all kinds of hardships, including the absolute decline of our economy, to preserve what we now regard as a de facto independence, which is, of course, de jure not an independence, because all countries that have a diplomatic relationship with the People's Republic of China, and this is the majority of countries of the world, have sort of accepted the idea that Taiwan is part of the People's Republic of China. That's why we say de jure, Taiwan is part of the People's Republic of China. De facto, it is an independent political entity, right? And those people who go for, we have to preserve the Taiwan island as an independent political entity. Those people say, if the mainland forces us into something that is not good for us, we have to show resistance, no matter what it costs, right? And the other people say, you know what? Our history tells us that this resistance cannot sustain for a long time, because this island can only survive if it has some kind of beneficial relationship to mainland China. And for that reason, they will say, because we want to survive economically, we have to find a new modus vivendi with mainland China. And this is actually what the leader of the Kuomintang is doing at this moment. And we have to have in mind that the Taiwan parliament at this moment is a parliament in which the majority of is actually on the pro-Kuomintang and pro-white, we call it the white sector of Taiwan policies. These two parties are actually opposition parties against our current president of Taiwan, because the president in Taiwan can be elected if he or she has more votes than others. And he had 32%. And by this, he had more votes than others. But we should keep in mind that he was only elected by 32% of the voters. And because the other parties all had their separate candidates, they jointly form a very strong position in parliament, but none of their candidates had more votes than Mr. Lai Ching-te. Right. So the situation is really very complicated in Taiwan. And I think this already shows that mainland Chinese policies have convinced the majority of voters on Taiwan that there needs to be some kind of modus vivendi in their relationship with mainland China, which does not necessarily mean that they are actually supporting the idea of a reunification, because if we look at service, we see that the majority of people on Taiwan, at least 75% of the population, wants to preserve the status quo. And therefore, I think the best solution at this moment would be to sit down with mainland China and have also international diplomats participating, so that the side of Taiwan could voice more of their interests, and to define a new status quo. Because the status quo that we have on Taiwan at this moment is actually the status quo of 1979, when China was a very different country in comparison to what it is now. And somehow China wants the international community, especially the US, and also the people in Taiwan, to recognize that power relationships have changed.
Absolutely. Very interesting. And so this visit should be seen in light of what you just said, because it really shines a new light on, first of all, the position they have in the parliament, and then also in the long term, or in the short term even, maybe renegotiating with, of course, a much empowered China as compared to before.
Oh, this implies, you asked the question, do we have to fear that maybe because of what is going on in Iran, because of what is going on in Ukraine, maybe China is now sort of getting ready to launch an assault on Taiwan. From my personal point of view, as I just said, I think they are trying to avoid military conflict with Taiwan, not only because they don't want to go into a military conflict as such, but as they definitely know that to conquer this island is extremely difficult, even if you use weapons on the highest level of technology, right? It is extremely costly. It's extremely risky. You will lose many, many young people. And China is an aging society. It has to think about, what do I do with my young people? And you have to keep in mind that in China, most families only have one child. So if you go to war, this one child will run the risk of dying much more than in times where you're not going to war against another country. So they will have to convince their population that going to war against Taiwan is worth the effort, even if so many, 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 many families will lose their only child. So according to internal assessments in China, they actually think that during the first week of war against Taiwan, they will already lose 250,000 young soldiers. And so from this point of view, I think they want to avoid this. But at the same time, I also think that there are certain constellations that force China into going to war against Taiwan. And one constellation is, of course, when the current situation sort of develops from multiple regional wars. At this time, we have two major regional wars going on simultaneously, one in Ukraine, one in Iran. And, if we know from history that if we have multiple regional wars going on simultaneously, it can easily create a situation where the regional war actually sort of ignites other wars in other regions, and then suddenly we have a world war, right? We also know that the idea that you could use nuclear weapons in situations where you cannot reach your aim by conventional means is not only a thought that is being debated in Moscow, but now we know that this is also a thought that is being debated in Washington, right? So very interestingly, this has nothing to do with norms and ideologies. In me being a structural realist, I would say, in a certain constellation, no matter what kind of guiding ideology your country actually sort of adheres to, in a certain power constellation, when you see that you cannot reach your aims by conventional means, or when you see that the existence of your state is being threatened, then this nuclear option is just around the corner. And I think this is something we unfortunately have to keep in mind, especially as we know that Israel also has a nuclear capacity of at least 150 warheads, which implies that, if Iran goes back to attacking Israel on a regular basis, they might come to the conclusion sooner or later that the existence of the Israeli state is being threatened, and that's why they have to use nuclear means to safeguard the existence of their country. So we are in a very, very tricky situation. And I think that a further escalation, which President Donald Trump actually sort of announced as one option during the last weeks, but then decided to go into a different direction. So if this escalation goes up the ladder to a certain point, I think that China might take the option of attacking Taiwan in order to make it very difficult for the U.S. to concentrate on the Near East. So this is one, I think, possible option we have to have in mind. We see at this moment that actually Foreign Minister Wang Yi suddenly traveled to North Korea. And the North Korea issue is also a very important issue that we very often forget. But if we look back in history, we see that very often regional wars in East Asia did not begin in Taiwan, but they began in Korea. So if you look at the first Sino-Japanese War from 1894 to 1895, for example, this is a war that took place on the Korean Peninsula, because the Korean Peninsula has an enormous strategic implication for how to dominate the Pacific. So from this point of view, China might even calculate that before launching an assault on Taiwan, they might want Korea to do something in order to sort of make the US think about the option of concentrating more on East Asia than on the Near East. And by this, sort of helping indirectly Iran to sustain this very difficult situation. So both Taiwan and Korea are in a very delicate situation as long as the war in Iran goes on. And then we also have the option that something very sort of maybe unexpected might happen inside China, with Xi Jinping's leading position inside the Communist Party of China being threatened to a point that he needs to take action against Taiwan in order to safeguard his leading position inside the party. Because one of the reasons why he cannot step down is that he brought so many people into prison, so many people have died during his tenure or committed suicide or something like this. So there are many, many enemies in China. And if you're not in a leading position, as someone who had a leading position in the past, then you can calculate on lots of retaliations to yourself, to your family, to your entourage, to everybody who has been supporting you in the past. So this is the reason why he cannot simply step down and say, sorry, I'm a little old. My health is not so good. So why doesn't somebody else take over? For him, this means he has to stick on and on and on, unless he will find a modus vivendi with his enemies inside the party and they guarantee his safety, he will not step down. So there might be a situation when his enemies don't want to wait any longer and threaten his leading position overtly. And in this situation, we also have to keep in mind that one option for him would be to launch an attack against Taiwan.
So very comprehensive answer here, and have lots of questions shooting through my head. But before we move on, maybe to talking about Xi Jinping's position, his leadership, maybe I don't know if you want to call it a crisis, but definitely questions which are surrounding that. Let's come back to the crisis that the world had this week, namely, of course, the escalation, which was so imminent with the deadline approaching in Iran. And then, of course, everyone breathed a sigh of relief that now we have a 14-day ceasefire, which started, of course, on the 7th of April. And according to TASS, which, of course, is the Russian official news agency, Beijing was very much involved in having the ceasefire come about. So they initially tried to contact Iran through intermediaries in Islamabad, Ankara, and Cairo. And then they actually, if you believe, or we go to this report, which is not being talked about much in the West, they actually contacted Iran directly. So in some way, they were very much involved in this ceasefire coming about. And of course, we know Donald Trump had said he was going to bomb Iran back to the Stone Ages, which is another point you mentioned, the whole nuclear question, which Mark Levin, who is a Fox host, was talking about possibly this happening. And he had some very inside information because I think he did have an interview with President Trump. So as you said, this was not off the table, especially for Israel, because as you mentioned, Israel does have quite a bit of nuclear capacity in its arsenal. And we all know that Israel is very unhappy now with the ceasefire. So that's another issue to be discussed. But what many people maybe don't know, that already on the 31st of March, China's Foreign Ministry of Affairs, together with Pakistan's Foreign Ministry, released a 5-point initiative, which they called 5-Point Initiative from China and Pakistan for Restoring Peace and Stability in the Gulf and the Middle East region. And very interestingly, these 5 points, the point 1 was immediate cessation of hostilities. Point 2 was start of peace talks as soon as possible, which we all know Friday is the big day when the U.S. and Iran are meeting in Islamabad. Point 3 is security of non-military targets. The world, of course, is in uproar because they have been targeting all these non-military targets, and that was on the table. before the ceasefire was agreed to, securing shipping lanes, which of course is in the interest of the entire globe because we're all suffering. And interestingly enough, as the point 5 was primacy of the United Nations Charter, which is another issue that we can discuss. So what is China's role in this ceasefire coming about? Does this not highlight how China's influence in the Middle East is increasing? The U.S. now being perceived by many countries around the world as the bully, and China the bringer of peace and diplomacy. And how will China guarantee that the Strait of Hormuz stays open? Because this, of course, is in the absolute interest of the world, but also of China.
Yeah. First of all, it's very interesting to see that China is pursuing this path of diplomacy. So they actually want to make clear that they are different both from Russia and the US in pursuing diplomacy. And whenever anything happens in the world, the first thing that the Chinese say, we have to de-escalate, we have to use diplomacy, we have to use political means in solving political problems and not military means in solving political problems. So they stick to this idea, and they sometimes seem to be quite marginalized by the other two big players, Russia and US, because they sort of are unwilling to use military means to solve any of the questions. And we just talked about the Taiwan issue. The Taiwan issue is an exception. Why? Because according to the understanding of the Chinese government, Taiwan is an issue of domestic politics, right? Is an issue where the UN doesn't have a say because it's domestic politics, right? And they sort of stick to this definition, although they know very much that this is a domestic issue with enormous influence on regional and international affairs, but they stick to this issue because as long as they define it as such, and as we just heard, all countries that have diplomatic relations with China also have to define it as such, then the UN has no say. Very interesting how they sort of create a situation here which is very well thought through and very difficult to sort of break through from the other side, right? So leaving this aside, now, I think that the Chinese, secondly, have a policy of diplomacy which says we do not communicate our policies to the outside world, including our own population. So, for example, I listen to Chinese TV every day. They have very interesting discussions on the situation in Iran, on the situation in Ukraine. Experts, have worked on these countries for years and years, who know every detail, right? They discuss different options, everything. They will never say one word about Chinese policies towards the issue. What do the Chinese do with regard to Ukraine? What do the Chinese do with regard to Iran? They don't say anything, right? So for them, this is very, very clear. Only their foreign ministry sort of sometimes gives comparatively vague explanations and answers to questions, but very seldom do they say anything that gives us a clear picture of what they're doing. And so, of course, we did not really know to which degree China was involved in bringing about this sort of ceasefire. The only thing we knew is that strategically speaking, China was the only country that could actually have some influence on Iran, except for Russia, right? And Russia, of course, also has a very strong relationship with Iran. To a certain degree, Russia is also more openly supporting the Iran side in this war against the US. So China had only one advantage in getting involved in this whole process. It did not openly support Iran, which is why Iran was sometimes not so happy about China, but which, on the other hand, made it possible for the US to accept that China had a certain say in this process of bargaining something between Iran and the US. And so China sort of kept low profile, both with regard to its public statements and with regard to its military support to Iran, in order to sort of define a position of moderator for itself that could be accepted by both sides, although both sides were not 100% happy with what China was doing. So this is very clever. This has proven to be a good position for many years in history, back in history. So they defined this position. So the second way we know a little bit about China and how China had an impact on this whole process is, of course, by relating to Russian sources. And on the other hand, it's also very important to relate to Taiwan sources, because the pro-mainland China forces in Taiwan are usually very well informed. They know details that most other people don't know. Why? Because they have an enormous impact on public discussions in Taiwan via private TV. And if they come up with more detailed information, then more people will listen to them than listen to the side of the president's party. And for that reason, they're always provided with very good information. And they actually have speculated from the first day of the war that the war would go on by having the war that the world can watch on the one hand side, and a bargaining process that nobody knows about on the other hand side, right? So according to their assessment, the war has been going on and bargaining has been going on from the first day. And China had to play a part insofar as it had to find a way to use its leverage with regard to Iran in a way that was not so obvious. So because China is, as we discussed at the beginning of our conversation today, it's heavily dependent on oil coming through the Strait of Hormuz. So, of course, China had an interest in talking to Iran, right? And in talking to Iran and having a certain leverage and using the idea of opening the Strait of Hormuz as their entrance point into discussions with Iran. So they're not sort of playing this country that is, sort of representing the interests of humanity as such. They're actually approaching Iran by saying, there is a comparatively big problem with my oil and gas supply here, and somewhat we have to tackle this problem, right? And very interestingly, I'm quite sure that they're using this strategy to open a window of opportunity to speak to Iran, and then to speak them into, to talk them into, why is a ceasefire good for you? Even though, according to what I heard on Chinese TV, their assessment is that this ceasefire is only good for 2 weeks and the war will go on after 2 weeks, because the US needed the ceasefire because their troops have not yet arrived in the Near East, and they know that they are needing more troops than they have at this point. Secondly, Israel is very unhappy, but could be talked into accepting the ceasefire, because that would give Israel a chance to focus on southern Lebanon and maybe hope for Iran not attacking them as fiercely as they did during the last days. And for Iran, the ceasefire, of course, was very important to show the population that escalation is not the only thing they needed to anticipate, that they could actually also sort of convince the US that there was a need for de-escalation. And the next escalation step was very, very high. I think one of the reasons why we heard people speaking so openly about the nuclear option in the US is actually because they wanted to put even more pressure on Iran into, in the direction of saying, you know what, if you don't do what we want, we simply throw a nuclear bomb on you. And I think that the regime in Iran wouldn't like to be responsible for anything like this. So that's why it was also in Iran's interest to agree to this ceasefire, but they are anticipating that the U.S. will go yet another step up on the escalation ladder after the ceasefire, but avoid taking this terrible option of throwing a nuclear bomb on Iran, because by that time they will have more conventional forces, and then maybe hope that they can reach their aim of stealing the enriched uranium from Iran. I think this seems to be one of their main aims now. As we can see from all their activities, they actually unfolded in the context of rescuing this second officer and things like this. Everything seems to have been related to an attempt to steal the enriched uranium from Iran.
Yes, that's what's coming out now, that the operation was actually to get the enriched uranium out of Iran, but then the Iranians shot down this plane, and then all the assets which had been brought in to do their plan were then used to retrieve this officer, which they ended up retrieving, which one has to say, which was very good for the United States, because that would have really been a huge blow to President Trump and might have just sealed his presidency once and for all. Many people are saying it's already sealed. But how does Israel play into this? I mean, does China have any leverage over Israel in any way that it could also put pressure on Israel? Because the Israelis, as you mentioned, are very unhappy with the ceasefire, and they said it doesn't cover Lebanon, and they're going on as before. So what happens to this fragile ceasefire if Israel just bombs the hell out of Lebanon for the next 2 weeks? That would be a disaster, not only for the population there, which is suffering greatly, but for peace, for a lasting peace, because of course the world would like a lasting peace.
Yeah. Well, I think at this moment, China only has an indirect impact on Israel. They used to have quite a friendly relationship and lots of collaborations in doing business together and in doing science together and things like this. But at this moment, I don't think that these forms of collaboration count a lot. So they only have an indirect relationship. So Israel has to take China into consideration, because obviously China has a good relationship to Iran, and indirectly they also have a good relationship to Hamas and Hezbollah. So from this point of view, Israel always has to take China into consideration. And if China decides to support Iran and Hezbollah and Hamas more openly than they have done so far, then I think this will not be good for Israel. So Israel cannot totally cut its diplomatic sort of conversations with China. At the same time, we have to see that as long as the Israel-US relationship holds, Israel does not have any need to reconsider its sort of diplomatic relationships and its military collaboration and things like this. So China will have more of an impact in a situation where conflict between the US and Israel arise. And we cannot totally disregard the possibility that with this war going on and the interests of the US and the interests of Israel going apart, then there might be more and more conflict in the relationship between the two. So we will have to have this in mind as one possible option. And in this situation, there is a very natural need for a country like Israel to sort of reconsider its alliances and look for other partners to support its agenda. So this is when China could come in. I'm not saying that it will come in, but it could come in. Structurally speaking, it could come in this situation. However, China does have quite an important leverage in its relationship to the US, which of course is also part of this equation here, right? And so for China to have to have an impact on Israel would also be for China to come to an agreement with the US on certain issues, which the US then would have to communicate with Israel. And the ongoing ceasefire seems to be something like this. China actually had to talk to Iran in order to convince Iran that ceasefire and de-escalation was a good option for them in this situation, although they mistrust the US and they anticipate that the US will use the ceasefire to actually do something really, really awkward, right? But I think that China used its leverage with regard to Iran to talk them into accepting this. At the same time, they had to convince Iran that China has enough leverage on the US to avoid the US sort of acting very openly and harshly against the ceasefire agreement. Because only if they could convince Iran that they had enough leverage on the US with regard to this question, could Iran actually agree to signing this ceasefire agreement? So because this is yet another triangle here, right? We see that sort of China is in a very delicate, very, very difficult position. But I must say, people know that I'm very critical, with many Chinese politicians. But I'm not among those who actually criticize Chinese diplomats. I think that there are very few countries in the world that have diplomats that are as good as the average Chinese diplomat. And I must also say that I have quite some respect for Foreign Minister Wang Yi, although many people think that, he is a terrible guy and he is a wolf diplomat and things like this. I don't think so. But anyway, I think that we can see that there is this indirect leverage that China is playing, and they're very skillful in playing this game. And no way for China to directly influence Israel, but many ways for China to indirectly influence Israel and Iran.
Suzanne, I still have so many questions, but I could go on and on talking with you for another hour, I'm sure, because of all the questions that I have from your answers. Very, very interesting. But it just really seems like China is positioning itself as a leader in a certain type of new world order that it sees for itself. And it would be interesting to see, because one of the points in its peace plan was also upholding the UN Charter. If China would just continue supporting this world order, which the U.S. was instrumental in setting up after the Second World War and what it stood for, or if it will end up actually changing that world order into something new. I mean, that probably would be just a whole new discussion that we could have here as well. But so many interesting points that you mentioned, and new perceptions and ways to look at all these questions that, of course, the world is debating now very hotly. And I do hope you are wrong, though, that there will be peace in Iran and that this is not only a 14-day ceasefire here. I'm really hoping for that. Is there anything else you'd like to say, Suzanne, before we end our discussion?
Yeah, thank you for this interesting conversation. I must tell you that I said, in China, I hear them assessing that this ceasefire will only be a ceasefire for 2 weeks and then the war will restart again. I did not give my own opinion because I'm obviously not an expert on this specific situation. But of course, I follow it quite closely. And I think during our last conversation, I was already a little bit more on the pessimistic side by saying, there is more reason to believe in escalation than in de-escalation. And I think that many analysts at the time tended to go into this direction. And very interestingly, we have a ceasefire that I don't think many people anticipated, including myself. But I tend, not because I want my prophecy to be correct, I still tend to see that there is more reason to go into escalation than into de-escalation. But at the same time, we also have to keep in mind that for Donald Trump, it seems to be more and more urgent to walk away from this war, because this war is taking a terrible toll on his, the kind of support that he has or used to have in the past and things like this. So he has to calculate, he has to use these 2 weeks now to develop an exit strategy, and maybe leave it to Israel to actually, like the way he likes for the Ukraine war, to leave it to Europe to solve the problem. So he would then leave it to Israel to solve the problem. But let me say one thing. And originally we wanted to talk a little bit more about, China's domestic situation.
Yeah.
I think, this is always something we need to have in mind. The world is ruled by 3 nuclear powers at this moment that are all very fragile with regards to their domestic constellation. They're having economic problems, they're having political problems, and they're having succession problems. All 3 of them have this, right? All 3 of them have comparatively old leaders, and some say that maybe 1 or 2 of them are a little bit too old for the kind of job they're doing at this time. And so they have a succession problem. They do not really know how to go into the next phase. And it is very tricky for them to assess whether they should continue with the same person into the same direction, which is not so easily possible for Donald Trump, but which could be possible for Xi Jinping and Putin, or whether they should actually sort of have someone else take over, because they're now approaching an age where simply things are too stressy for them to handle. And we know that Xi Jinping has had major health problems during the last 2 or 3 years. So there are people in China sort of using his health problems in order to make an argument saying, we definitely need to replace him, because if we don't replace him now and the crisis is getting worse, then we will have to replace him in the middle of a major crisis. And this will be even worse than replacing him now, right? So, with other words, Xi Jinping is sitting on this throne, and the outside world perceives him as being, extremely powerful. But somehow we see that internal structures within the Chinese elite are not stable anymore. So just last week, he ousted yet another member of the Politburo, which is really something that happens very, very rarely in China. He only a few weeks ago, he ousted his top general. In his military commission, there are only 2 people left, himself and 1 other guy. So, except for 7, right? So this shows that under this enormous pressure from outside and pressure from inside that comes from the economy, but also from the field of social stability. So this elite does what Chinese elites have always done under these constellations. They start splitting. And when the elites start splitting, then social stability gets worse and worse, because people among the populace, they know that this elite is splitting. And as they cannot cast a vote for this party or that party, they then sort of more or less openly find ways to align with either of the 2 or 3 or 4 different factions inside the elite. And the more this develops, the more the elite splits, because they see, oh my gosh, we are losing social stability. And then they come up with all different ideas, how can we overcome this situation? And so this internal stress and the external stress combined makes it very, very difficult for China to be, the country that many people might envisage at this moment. In the US, everything is a chaos. In Russia, nothing works as well as people might want Russia to work well. And only China is the country with this wonderful authoritarian system, where Xi Jinping can take all kinds of decisions without being challenged. And it's not true. It's not true, right? And for people who know a little bit more about the domestic constellation in China, the situation is very precarious. This last guy that was ousted from the Politburo, we don't think that he was ousted by Xi Jinping. He was ousted by Xi Jinping's enemies, because this guy is actually a close friend of Xi Jinping's wife. So, I mean, this is such a complicated situation. Actually, a situation which I encountered in 1976 when I was in China as a young student. I was in the middle of Beijing on campus of the university that was the most highly politicized university in China at the time. We knew that there were ruptures inside the elites, but we were unable to participate how these ruptures would then eventually evolve into, a fundamental change of policy at the top of the Communist Party of China. When a similar thing happened in 1989, I already had this experience in mind of 1976. And of course, many grown-ups in China have these two experiences, just like me. They know about the situation 1976, they know about the situation 1989. And now they look at what is going on and they have a déjà vu experience. They say, oh, somewhat. I've already encountered this constellation in the past. So I have to be very, very much aware of something changing inside China too. So the main enemy for China growing into a leading world power is its internal instability.
Very interesting. But isn't now what the world really needs? I mean, is a stable China? I mean, with all these wars going on and the possibility of a nuclear threat looming in the background and maybe not looming so quietly anymore, wouldn't like an internal power struggle at this moment in China be like the last thing which would be good for a world order and for stability and peace? Because as we see now, China is really the driving force behind this possible diplomatic solution to this war in Iran, which could be catastrophic.
You're right. I think, the world and the world crisis would be much easier to handle if we could rely on China being extremely stable. But the political system in China is a system that is as reactive to internal and external crisis as any other political system, right? And this implies that, you see this in our democratic countries just as much as you see it in China. The moment you have to react to this double pressure, you will definitely come up with different options. And for a one-party system, the idea that you might take the wrong option, and this wrong option will then lead to a total crash of the system, makes these systems very intelligent in choosing their options because their risk is so high. There is no alternative. If this Communist Party of China chooses the wrong option, there is no alternative because there is no alternative party that could take over and say, okay, they made the mistake, so now I take over with my option. No, right? And for that reason, I think they are quite clever because for them, the risk assessment is always higher than for parties in a democratic system. This is something we have to have in mind. And that's the reason why at this moment we look at China and think that, if we do have a rational actor somewhere in this system of international relations, it is China. Unfortunately, by the way, I don't think that China is talked about enough at this moment. We talk about Russia, we talk about the US, we talk about Israel, we talk about Iran, everything, but the China factor is somewhat so obscure that most people, even those who are really interested in world affairs as such, would usually talk about China because they don't know about China. And they don't think that they can understand what's going on in China. But you see that this political system has its internal logic, and this logic makes it strong and fragile at the same time. And it can topple over in this direction or can stand up in that direction. Both is possible. And to make a long story short, the reason why Mr. Xi Jinping is still in power, although there are more and more people in China who wish that he might step down, is that China wants to preserve this image of stability by sticking to Xi Jinping as its representative, while all kinds of discussions and, possible options and changes are being sort of pursued without us knowing too much about it and without the Chinese population knowing too much about it. So from my point of view, they're already preparing the next step because their rationality tells them that they have to convince Mr. Xi Jinping to step down. He knows that he is on the brink of having to step down, but he wants to get safety guarantees for himself, his family, and his entourage. So they're still in a bargaining process, right? And this bargaining process with him is at the same time a bargaining process among the different factions. So what will be our future policies? What will be our future policies? Because they will have to come up with a new set of policies once Xi Jinping will have stepped down. And according to my assessment, I think they will keep him, if he doesn't have a major health problem again, they will keep him until the next party congress, which will take in 2027.
Wow. So interesting, Suzanne. Thank you. This really, I don't think many people in this world have such deep knowledge of the internal workings of China and its history. And I think you really gave us a new outlook on how also to look at our, the hot spots of what's going on in the world by bringing in the China perspective, which, of course, as you correctly say, not many people talk about, because I think not many people have the information and the knowledge to make any sort of assessment of the situation from a Chinese perspective. So I'd like to really thank you for sharing that with us today. It was extremely interesting. I learned a lot. Thank you so much. If it's okay with you, I would now close our discussion.
Yes, I think we shouldn't. We are now talking for nearly 1.5 hours, and I think our listeners are sort of ready to do something else. But for me, it was a pleasure to discuss these issues with you. And you see that the world is producing new topics every week. We are not running out of topics, and I hope that also for our listeners, this is sort of an opportunity to include the Chinese perspective into our understanding of the world, which I think is so important. And we are actually lagging behind because China is already much more involved than we are able to understand. And we have to slowly but steadily learn how to include China into our world perspective. And I hope that our conversation is slowly but steadily sort of making a contribution to creating this new view on the world.
I hope so as well. Thank you very much. And to our viewers and listeners, thank you so much for tuning in to another session of iGlobeViews. You can find all our sessions on our website at www.iglobenews.org and on our YouTube channel with the handle iGlobeNews. Please like, follow, and subscribe. And we look forward to having you tune in for future discussions. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.